Amidst the fiery skies of World War II, where black smoke clung to steel wings and shrapnel fell like rain, America achieved what once seemed impossible. It turned the headwind itself into a weapon that would guide victory. In 1943, the skies over Europe were like a colossal furnace. At altitudes above 7,000 meters, temperatures dropped to -40°C, and the air grew so thin that each breath drained the pilot's strength. Yet the B-17, flying fortresses of the U.S. 8th Air Force, kept cutting through the clouds, heading straight for the industrial heart of Nazi Germany. Their targets were Schweinfurt, Regensburg, Bremen, cities of steel, oil, and machinery. The Americans believed that by destroying these factories, they could cripple Hitler's war machine. It was a belief called precision daylight bombing, a strategy of pinpoint bombing in broad daylight, the pride of American technological prowess. In Washington, generals declared, "We can drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from 4 miles up." Their proof was a miraculous device called the Norden bomb sight, a bomb-aiming instrument seen as a marvel of modern engineering. That small machine, weighing over 20 kilon and costing $8,000, the price of a house, worked like a mechanical computer, calculating speed, wind direction, and altitude, then automatically adjusting the bomb's trajectory. In demonstrations over the New Mexico desert, test pilots had dropped bombs into circles just 30 meters wide. This was the American dream, a dream of flawless engineering, of man conquering the sky with formulas and gears. But Europe was not the desert, and war never follows theory. On August 17, 1943, more than 376 B-17s took off from the damp airfields of eastern England. They flew over the English Channel, over occupied France, toward Schweinfurt, where the Kugelfischer and SKF factories produced over 40% of Germany's ball bearings. Along the way, they encountered something no lab had ever accounted for: high-altitude crosswinds blowing at over 100 miles per hour. Combined with fire from hundreds of 88 mm flak guns, the sky turned into hell. Each 88 could fire 15 rounds a minute, exploding at 25,000 feet, each shell scattering thousands of razor-sharp metal shards. Aluminum shredded, fuselages riddled with holes. 10 men in a crew, one shell through the cockpit was enough to end it all. When the formations reached the target, smoke screens had already engulfed the entire industrial zone. The bombardiers, crouched in the nose, saw only a gray sea of smoke. Per protocol, they had to fly straight and level for 3 full minutes for the Norden to compute accurately. But 3 minutes in German flak range was a death sentence. Some pilots held the line, others swerved for survival. The bombs dropped from the bellies of the planes, fell through the clouds, and were swept into the swirling wind. When the smoke cleared, no one could tell where the target had been. That day, 60 planes were shot down. 600 men never came back. Of the 700 tons of bombs dropped on Schweinfurt, less than 200 hit the factory area. The rest landed on wheat fields, villages, and even an old church 3 miles away. In the diary of Lieutenant John Morris, a navigator from the 301st Bomb Group, one line read, "Counted 127 holes in the fuselage. Don't know how we're still alive. Jenkins died before we crossed the channel. He was 19. In the sky, the surviving B-17s limped home, charred and broken, earning them a bitter nickname among American crews, the aluminum cloud. When the bodies returned to Kimballton Base, no one spoke. Everyone knew the faith in precision bombing had cracked. The mission maps were full of blanks, and the generals in Washington had grown silent. No one questioned the courage of the pilots. They had flown through hell. But the problem was this: bravery couldn't replace mathematics. Industrial warfare demanded numbers, not luck. The 8th Air Force Command calculated that to destroy a single factory bombs needed to land within 1,000 feet of the aiming point. In reality, their average error radius was over 3,200 feet, which meant most bombs fell into nothing. Failure followed failure. In the summer of 1943, some days saw survival rates as low as 25%. For every 4 men who took off, only 1 returned. Some missions began with 30 planes and ended with 9. Along with human losses came the collapse of morale. Engineers asked, "Why are the errors so big?" Pilots answered, "The wind. It's always the wind." But no one had a solution. In cold English tea shacks between missions, men shared stories of the pickle barrel, the mythical barrel Americans once claimed they could hit from 4 miles up. Now, it had become a cruel joke. The war wasn't over, but faith nearly was. And then, in that despair, fate delivered a mistake, so small it was almost laughable, and yet it opened a new path. A single misstep over Schweinfurt in October 1943, when one B-17 flew off course, and in doing so, uncovered the answer to an entire war. Sometimes, the greatest turning points in history don't begin with triumph, but with a mistake. Germany, October 1943. Autumn was cold, and the winds were brutal. In the gray skies above Schweinfurt, the Wright Cyclone engines screamed like wounded beasts. A squadron of 18 B-17s from the 305th Bomb Group had veered off course from the main formation of the 8th Air Force. Why? A small miscalculation in wind direction by navigator, Captain Robert Williams. He had planned to lead the formation from the north toward the target, as instructed by command. But at 25,000 feet, the westerly winds were stronger than expected, pushing the whole group east. By the time he realized it, it was too late to turn back. Below them, German flak was exploding into a wall of fire, and Messerschmitt 109 fighters had already locked on. Williams looked at his map. If they tried to circle back, they'd lose formation and get picked off one by one. Not an option. He had to decide. In the nose compartment, Lieutenant Charles Murphy, the bombardier, waited for orders. Williams, breathing hard through his oxygen mask, spoke into the intercom. "We're off course. Stay on this heading. Murphy, recalculate the wind. We'll drop the bombs, but not directly on the target." Murphy looked up, puzzled. "Not directly on the target." That phrase had never appeared in any training manual. Williams pointed at the Norden screen. "Wind's blowing west to east, right? If we aim northwest, the wind will carry the bombs southeast, right where the factory is." 1 minute later, the command came. "Hold altitude. Prepare to drop." Murphy adjusted the bomb sight, re-entered the data, 90 mph crosswind, altitude 25,000 RFT, speed 180 meters stator, offset angle 45°. He took a deep breath and aimed, not at the factory, but at a stretch of empty railway nearly 2 miles away. As the Norden's countdown ticked away, the entire compartment fell silent. 3, 2, 1. Bombs away. All 18 B-17s opened their bomb bay doors and dropped 216 500-pound bombs. From above the clouds, no one knew what was happening below. They only heard flak bursts and turned west, racing out of hell. 3 days later, reconnaissance aircraft brought photos of Schweinfurt back to Kimbolton Base. The intelligence officers stared at them in silence. On those black and white prints, the 305th's bomb pattern sliced straight through the center of the industrial complex, while most other squadrons had missed by miles. 42% of their bombs had landed inside the factory zone, a result never seen since the campaign began. At first, people said it was luck. But Williams didn't believe in luck. He gathered all the flight logs, wind data, airspeeds, headings, and proved, mathematically, that it was the crosswind that caused deviation, and that only by aiming off target could the bombs hit true. The idea sounded too simple to believe. Until then, Norden calculations had always assumed bombers flew directly toward the target, affected only by headwinds or tailwinds. But at 25,000 feet, crosswinds were common, creating what pilots called a crab angle, a diagonal heading needed to stay on course. And when bombs fell from a crabbing plane, they carried that sideways momentum, drifting thousands of feet off target. Williams called it offset aiming, deliberate misalignment, not to accept error, but to use the wind. Murphy, the bombardier, explained in his technical report, if the wind blows 90 km west to east and the bomb falls for 60 seconds, it will drift about 1.5 miles. If I aim 1.5 miles west of the factory, the bomb will drift right onto it. The wind is no longer the enemy. It's our ally. When the report reached 8th Air Force Command, many laughed. Aim off to hit? It sounded like a joke. But photo comparisons silenced the room. The 305th's average deviation was just 1,100 feet, compared to the overall force's 3,200 feet. An unplanned discovery, but fully accurate. In the following weeks, Williams and Murphy were summoned to High Wycombe, headquarters of the 8th Air Force in England. There, they presented their method. Measure wind speed using the double drift method. 2 drift readings through the bomb site. Calculate the necessary offset angle to counter the wind. Select a visible offset aiming point, usually a distinctive feature upwind of the target. Maintain a stable heading and drop bombs at that point, letting the wind carry them to the true target. When recon photos showing tightly grouped strikes were projected, the command board fell silent. One general finally said, "If this isn't luck, then it's a breakthrough." But in war, theory meant nothing without testing. In early December 1943, the 8th Air Force ordered trials. 5 squadrons flew parallel missions, 3 using the traditional method, 2 using Williams' offset approach. The resulting photographs were crystal clear. Offset groups had dense, accurate bomb clusters centered on the factories. Traditional groups were still off by thousands of feet. A technical analyst noted, offset bombing reduced average deviation by 60%. In strong winds, it performs even better. For the first time since the campaign began, data backed human intuition. It was no longer about faith in machines, but about the triumph of reason and the courage to face mistakes and fix them. Murphy, once just the man in the nose, pressing a button, had become a teacher. He told his team, "We all want to hit the target, but sometimes, to hit it, we must learn to aim away." That line spread across bases like a new creed, because in the fire of war, this simple truth held a survival philosophy. When the world shifts against you, don't resist the wind. Learn to ride with it. Just weeks later, their discovery reached one man, a man who would turn this tiny mistake into a doctrine that would transform the entire U.S. Air Force, General James Harold Doolittle. Sometimes, war doesn't need a genius. It needs someone humble enough to learn from a mistake. January 1944. Cold winds from the North Sea blew across the waterlogged fields of eastern England, where hundreds of B-17 fortresses lay idle on the muddy runways. The U.S. daylight bombing campaign was stuck in a dead end. Pilots were exhausted, and faith shattered. In the year-end report for 1943, 8th Air Force officers wrote succinctly, "Average accuracy, 3,200 feet. Strategic effectiveness, inadequate. Personnel losses, over 25%. Each figure in that report represented a life lost. At bases such as Kimballton, Bassingbourn, Thorpe Abbotts, there were days when no alarm was needed. The missing in action siren sounded before dawn. In the mess halls, empty chairs outnumbered occupied ones. And in the eyes of the survivors, what showed most clearly was not fear, but doubt. Were their sacrifices meaningful if bombs still fell far from their goals? Then, one morning, a jeep pulled up to 8th Air Force headquarters at High Wycombe. From the vehicle stepped a man of compact build, sturdy presence, clear eyes, and steady voice. Major General James Harold Doolittle. He was already a national hero. 2 years earlier, he had commanded the 1942 Tokyo raid, the audacious mission that brought war to the Japanese home islands. But few knew that Doolittle was more than a daring pilot. He was a scientist, the first ever to hold an aeronautical degree from MIT. He had flown under blind conditions, proving that pilots could trust instruments rather than eyesight. When Doolittle accepted command of the 8th Air Force from General Ira Eaker, he entered the hazy, smoke-filled meeting room, surveyed the downcast faces, and spoke one line. "We are fighting on faith when we should be fighting on facts." That line, simple yet thunderous, marked the beginning of a complete transformation. Doolittle immersed himself in all the Schweinfurt campaign reports. He paid special attention to the presentation by Captain Robert Williams and Lieutenant Charles Murphy. "Offset aiming? Interesting," he murmured, then asked them to represent their full mathematical model. As Williams stood before a large chart, drawing wind triangles and dashed lines, Doolittle listened closely. He did not scoff or interrupt. He only nodded occasionally. When the presentation ended, he said deliberately, "You have turned a mistake into a method. We shall turn that method into strategy." From that moment, offset bombing officially stepped beyond experimental status to become the new combat doctrine of the 8th Air Force. In under a month, Doolittle issued Field Order Number 259, a classified directive standardizing the wind offset bombing technique. Under it, any mission with crosswinds over 40 km had to use offset aiming. Navigators were required to measure high-altitude wind via the double drift method, determine an offset angle of 30-50 degree, choose a phantom aiming point, and release bombs by a unified procedure. This was more than tactical change. It was an industrial overhaul. Doolittle knew that theory only gains value when it becomes habit for thousands. He ordered offset training centers opened across England at Kimbleton, Lavenham, Thorpe Abbotts, Framlingham. Each base had classrooms, blackboards, wind models, and instructors drawn from the pilots who had survived Schweinfurt. Morning lessons covered formulas. Afternoons flew trial runs. Over Norfolk skies, hundreds of B-17s fanned out, dropping bombs on mock targets in the North Sea. Each flight snapped reconnaissance photos, measured errors, returned for analysis, and flew again. Day in, day out. No one spoke of glory. They spoke only of wind, angle, drop time, speed, and data. That attitude, the industrialized patience of converting knowledge into practice, was the distinct spirit of America. During one training session, Doolittle watched B-17s queuing into takeoff. A young officer asked, "General, do you really believe this method will change results?" He smiled and replied, "I don't believe in luck. I believe in measuring wind." That modest philosophy encapsulated the core of U.S. military science in those years, every decision based on numbers, not blind faith. After 3 weeks of training, trial results stunned everyone. Squadrons using offset achieved an average error of only 1/100 feet, while direct drop units still averaged over 3,000 feet. Recon photos showed concentrated strike zones, tight, dense, centered on goals. Doolittle immediately ordered full expansion. Every 8th Air Force unit must adopt offset starting February 1944. He also empowered meteorological groups to intensify upper air wind observations, sending updated reports every 6 hours so navigators would have the latest data. Each cog in the war machine was tightened, from weather analysts, reconnaissance photo teams, to bombardiers. They all spoke the same language: drift, wind angle, fall distance. They were no longer young men hoping luck would carry their bombs. They were knowledge workers in modern aerial warfare. In March 1944, command statistics revealed the percentage of bombs landing within target zones rose from 11% to 27%, average error dropped nearly 60%, and pilot losses declined month by month. Doolittle forbade celebrations. He hung in his office a single drawing, a wind triangle annotated with handwritten text. Wind is no longer the enemy. In later memoirs, one officer who worked closely with him wrote, "He didn't come to change men. He came to change how we think. We learned that when intellect is organized like industry, it can be stronger than any weapon." On the wet, cold runways of England, spring 1944 arrived along with new confidence. Disappointed pilots now stood by their aircraft, pored over wind charts, and smiled. They no longer said, "I hope we hit." They said, "We measured the wind." And as the wind maps filled the walls of command rooms, one great campaign loomed on the horizon, a push whose outcome would shape Europe's future. D-Day. The B-17s flew in formation, as orderly as a parade. In every heart aboard, one certainty: today was a historic day. Operation Overlord, the largest amphibious assault mankind had ever attempted. On the map were 5 beaches spanning 50 miles: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, Sword. Below, over 5,000 warships were cleaving waves toward the shore. Above, nearly 2,000 heavy bombers held the path forward. They must obliterate the German coastal fortresses before the Allied troops landed. The order was simple, the mission almost impossible. Stormy weather, thick, low clouds, poor visibility, and upper-level winds of 25-40 mm strong enough to push hundreds of pounds of bombs off by miles. Yet, thanks to 6 months of relentless training, the 8th Air Force was ready. Inside each plane flew 3 men whose calculations would decide the fate of the armada: the pilot, the navigator, the bombardier. They were no longer merely fighters. They'd become mathematicians and engineers, wielding physics in war. Before takeoff, the navigator double-checked the wind chart. Northwest 30 km, altitude 12,000 ft. He sketched a small triangle: flight path, wind direction, offset heading. Below him, the bombardier nodded, picking a phantom aiming point, a bend in the coast several miles from the fortress. All calculated, offset angle 45 degrees. At 5:55 a.m., bombs began to fall. From 12,000 ft, the bombs dropped, passed through clouds, then vanished. None saw the target, none knew hit or miss. They only knew they had followed every calculation, and the wind, once cursed, would finish the job. Hours later, when the U.S. 4th Infantry landed on Utah Beach, they found the unexpected. Most German emplacements had been destroyed. The guns were silent. The concrete forts were cracked ruins. Recon photos later confirmed 25 out of 28 fortifications at Utah had been knocked out entirely. That was the result of offset bombing combined with H-2X radar guidance, a triumph of intellect, not just explosives. But eastward at Omaha Beach, the outcome was different. Fearing bombs would fall short onto troops, some crews delayed their release for a few seconds. Just 3 seconds at 184 Tarost meant a 250-meter drift. The bombs plunged far inland, leaving coastal defenses intact. When American infantry advanced, they encountered a maelstrom of fire, and many fell in the first minutes. 2 beaches, 2 executions of the same principle, and 2 fates. At Utah, disciplined mathematics saved thousands. At Omaha, a moment's fear turned miscalculation into tragedy. After the campaign ended, reconnaissance analysts spent weeks aggregating results. They concluded, bombing effectiveness at Utah approached 90%, while at Omaha it was barely above 30%. cold numbers, but carved with lessons. Every victory begins with discipline. Doolittle read the report silently, then scribbled a note to Supreme Command. There is no magic tactic. Only those who do their math right, even amid bombs, will prevail. After D-Day, offset bombing became the 8th Air Force standard. Every mission included a wind map, approach angle, phantom aiming point, standardized to the squadron level. Meteorological units worked 24/7. Every data point was fed into IBM Mark I mechanical computers for recalculation. For the first time in history, war was operated like a data production line. And the results speak for themselves. In the final 6 months of 1944, the volume of American bombs dropped on Germany increased 340%, while average error dropped nearly 200%. The oil plants in the Ruhr, tank factories in Kassel, and even the Merseburg steel works, all were successively paralyzed. When Soviet forces advanced from the east, they found German industry little more than scrap metal. But more important than collapsed buildings was how humans had learned from the wind and their own errors. An old pilot recounted in a 1982 interview, "We had no computers, only pencils and mechanical calculators. But we believed in those equations, because they were written in the blood of those who didn't come home." Those words ring as an elegy for a generation. They did not conquer by miracle, but by organized intellect, discipline, and perseverance. As snow blanketed the old English airfields, the war was drawing to a close. But the legacy of Doolittle and his colleagues endured. Wind charts, offset formulas, and angled bombing became the foundation of modern aerial bombardment. As the U.S. Air Force entered a new era, they were etched into training manuals, the first lesson every navigator would learn. Do not fight the wind. Know which way it blows, and fly with it. The war ended, but the roar of engines still echoes somewhere in memory. On Europe's bare landing fields, the twisted steel frames of flying fortresses lie silent, like relics. Humans returned, carrying more than scars. They carried knowledge, formulas written in white chalk amid cold winds, lessons paid for with lives. The U.S. Air Force entered a new era. From the ashes of war, they fashioned a philosophy, one of precision, discipline, and science. Offset bombing, once dismissed as reckless, became the first chapter in pilot training curricula. Young airmen followed in the footsteps of their predecessors, learning to read wind, calculate offsets, and understand that sometimes, to hit the mark, one must willingly aim off. In the western deserts of America, new bombers were born. Larger airframes, stronger engines, far greater range. In cockpits where pilots once bent over mechanical sights, now sat electronic control panels, radar, mechanical computers, and eventually microchips. But the principle remained the same. Designers of the next generation's bombing systems retraced the roots, returning to the wind triangle sketched by Williams and Murphy amid fire and smoke. The strategic bomber B-52, the icon of the nuclear era, still relies on that principle. Inside its navigation bubble, radar not only locates the target but computes the optimal offset point so bombs fall accurately in wind. The pilot need not see the objective. They look at data, wind speed, heading, altitude. The automatic system computes coldly, but behind it lives the thought of those nervously seated in B-17 noses. When B-52s climb into stormy skies at night, few realize that inside each programmed calculation, the breath of those who fell over Europe lingers. A defense engineer once told a Pentagon meeting, "Technology may change, but wind is still wind. We only learn to understand it better." Then the winds shifted. As warfare evolved, the targets were no longer broad cities, but forests, hidden trails beneath tropical clouds. B-52s flew high above storms, dropping bombs through thousands of feet of dense cloud. Even there, controllers relied on the old principle: pick an offset, compute the drift, trust geometry. They knew wind could carry a bomb miles, but if calculated correctly, wind could become an ally. Early radar data showed mean errors just over 1,000 feet, almost perfect under brutal conditions. The world acknowledged offset bombing had transcended Ubuntu and become the language of modern aerial warfare. Then the digital age dawned. Computers, satellites, GPS systems emerged. People believed they had broken all limits. With GPS and laser guidance, they could hit a window from 30,000 feet. Yet in the shadows of electronic warfare, with jamming and signal loss, pilots reopened their worn notebooks, the page with formulas: wind speed x fall time sonmar drift, offset heading som meist angle between wind and flight path. So simple it's unforgettable, yet one formula had saved thousands. A young officer later recalled, "When GPS was locked out, we switched to manual mode, and strangely those old numbers still worked, as if someone from the past was guiding us." Today, stealth bombers glide in silence. Inside their control systems is no bomb aimer in a nose compartment, but the principle they discovered remains intact, now coated in silicon instead of chalk. A recent U.S. Air Force report read, "In GPS-denied combat environments, offset bombing is not heritage, it's survival skill. When cadets sit in simulators, learning bombing by radar, instructors still warn, do not forget the wind. No matter how smart the computer, wind will win if you fail to factor it." So the story that began from a small mistake in the skies of Germany lives on. A deviation, a turned angle, an idea, and an entire world transformed. Robert Williams, the old navigator of the 305th, after the war became an engineer. Charles Murphy, the bombardier who found how to aim off to hit, taught mathematics to students. Neither thought of himself as a hero, but when asked the secret of their success, they always said, "We didn't invent anything, we just listened to the wind." Seen from afar, that tale is more than the history of a bombing technique. It's proof of the power of human intellect learning from error. When formulas, models, and ideas are organized like an industrial chain, when discipline and creativity coexist, even wind can become an ally. In the skies of a new century, when technology has outpaced imagination, everything still starts from that little offset decades ago, quietly living in every line of code, every computed trajectory, every flight path. Because history, however cloaked in metal and silicon, is written by human hands. The voice slows, like the distant echo of metal meeting wind. They flew through storms, they learned to measure wind, and through precision they turned randomness into victory, not for one war, but for the future.